So I'm not totally sure as to what Luana has just said, but I will just repeat a little bit about myself. And first of all, I'm glad to be here, and I want to thank Luana for bringing me in and inviting me. And of course, she's a great friend and a great artist. I'll be talking about some recent work, which is going to be just a little fraction of what I'm doing. As I think you know, I'm from Berlin. At this point, I've studied in Germany, so I am German. I was born in Germany, I studied in Germany and in London, and then I went to New York for a little bit, and then I came basically back to Berlin and have continued my work in Berlin since. I'd like to encourage you to ask questions if you have any at any point. So this would be great if this could be a conversation rather than me giving some sort of monologue. But let's start it that way to give you some background. There is one piece. I'm going to show you a video, which is about five minutes. And before I start that, it's a piece that was completed earlier this year. It's actually, in terms of scale, the biggest installation that I have done so far, so it was exciting for me in many ways. Let me just go through it. I'll show you the video. It's a 100-meter long hallway, a very specific kind of space, and I'll talk a little bit as we go through the video, and then once you got the background, we can talk some more. So let me just start it. It goes actually from the from the one end to the other, so you'll get a sense of the whole piece pretty much. Okay, so we're actually just starting right now. Let's see if this goes. Yeah, this goes away. And so these are the office spaces of a collector, and the commission was to basically design a piece for the space. So I was pretty much given free hand to do whatever I had in mind, propose, and then realize the concept. So you'll see I can talk more about this. It's basically a piece that's based on a text, and you'll see on both sides of the walls, like we produced these elements, text elements that were then mounted. And of course, there's a whole background as to how the text was chosen, the colors, and all of that. But maybe it could be more useful, instead of going into the subject matter at this point, to talk a little bit about how to approach a space like that and how to conceive of a work. In fact, how to work with a space. I mean, it's a pretty massive space, so as an artist, it's quite, I think, a certain challenge, as to how to deal with that. And the text is, in fact, German. I'm not sure how many of you would be able to read that, but I can give you some background in terms of that too. And you see here is the middle piece where the idea was for, the text to like almost dissolve into, into this abstract, kind of chaotic, situation, basically, and then, and then sort of reassemble into a coherent structure, which is about to do right now. As you can see, these fractions coming back together on the left, basically, and coming back together and making up something more whole. And yeah, I mean, I guess I should say a little bit about how the text was chosen, although I'd like not to emphasize that too much. It's the sources are basically philosophy, so it's from Nietzsche and another philosopher, and basically it's about, I'll keep this brief, not to make it too confusing. It's about this idea of circularity, Nietzsche has this idea of the eternal return, of history always comes back, repeats itself, and the other part, the yellow part that we had in the beginning, was also dealing with this idea of possible worlds and identities and contingency. And so the piece itself, in terms of subject matter, is pretty much about this idea of how history unfolds, repeats itself. It's this idea of repetition and how, in fact, societies and history develops, to keep it in a nutshell. But then, of course, that's just the subject matter, right? The question is, how do you put that into a certain form, and how that is, physically realized in the space. This is all steel text, which is laser cut and welded onto a rail. You can see this here, and then mounted on the wall. And the piece, you can see it's always cut down to the centimeter. In fact, it is designed for the space. So, so obviously all measurements were taken, and then there was just an awful lot of computer work to actually design these kind of shapes, specifically to the specifications of that spatial situation. And you see here the text is kind of distorted oftentimes. So it's not just text, it's also, I was trying to treat text as something malleable, something you can give sort of form to, and something that's not as stable as we may oftentimes think it is. So this is the end. We're basically done. And I can actually just show you a couple images to have some background when we talk more. Okay. Yeah, so again, right, this was the beginning. I mean, of course, you all saw this, and I'll stop with an image of the middle piece, because that's, I think, the most interesting. Yeah, okay. So this, for example. Yeah, and so every single little piece was welded, cut, and obviously there was somewhat more freedom for me to, to play around with these shapes here, because it's less formal, right? But then, of course, everything else there was a pretty strict kind of formal concept as to where everything would be placed. Now, I'm not sure if this was maybe a little bit confusing. Maybe did you understand what basically this the project was, or do you have any questions at this point? Yeah. Office?
Yes.
Well, it's a group of companies, and they have their headquarters there. They're producing textiles, basically. In fact, it's actually an interesting sort of question, because, of course, when you do a work in a situation like this, people, of course, kind of tend to ask you to which extent the background of the company does factor into the work. And for me, in terms of this, I've always took the position that the space is very significant, and the piece is all about the space. But then, of course, I was trying kind of hard to sort of forget about what the company actually produces. Otherwise, you sort of easily end up making a kind of an illustration of what they do. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I would say that for me, in this case, it was really I try to make it not relevant, you know, what the background of the company is. So I try to treat it as almost like an exhibition space, right? Which of course you can't really, because you have people working there, walking, and you can't obviously interfere with the daily sort of practice of what's going on. But otherwise, I try to look at it as if it was sort of neutral in a way, or to pretend that it would be, right? But it's a very good question that way, yeah. And so, yeah, I guess, I mean, yeah, I'm not an installation artist per se. I'm not a text artist or anything. So this is just really a fraction of my work. But maybe an interesting, you know, idea is how to approach a situation like this, right? Because obviously it's very different from. I'm not sure how many of you are. You're all making art yourselves, are you? Okay, so you're starting. Okay, that's great. Very exciting, right? But you know, I mean, obviously it's very different from a situation where you're making art in the studio and where you kind of sort of have a certain freedom as to what you do, and it's kind of autonomous in terms of space, right? It travels around, and it starts to become different when you, you know, when you make a piece for a certain space. Because I think very different, the questions that arise, you know, become sort of different, and it's actually can be very interesting. So I actually have, I've studied for a number of years in Germany with Daniel Buren. Some of you may know, it's a pretty famous artist at this point, who basically exclusively works with this idea of site specificity, and you know, this idea that a work of art always has a certain link to the space within which it is produced. I mean, space not just in spatial terms, but also, you know, politically and socially. And while I don't take that position necessarily, that for me was a very sort of formative experience to be working with someone like him. And certainly that a work like that, you know, clearly you can see that influence there. But it's really about, I think, for me, you know, in the beginning, it's about like sort of letting the space speak to you versus, you know, versus the idea of everything just sort of coming out of yourself. So I guess you really have to, in a way, in that way, I think, sort of develop the ability to understand how a space kind of speaks to you and sort of decode this information. And then, you know, so as to be able to respond to that. So I see that work very much as a response to the space, you know, as opposed to something that is, yeah, all right. That is sort of imposed onto it. So I think this way of working can actually be very interesting. Though I'm not actually taking this as an exclusive position. So I have a studio practice. I do all kinds of stuff, but I have a specific interest in that kind of work. And of course, then you have all these practical questions, right? You have a certain budget. How are you going to work with that? Always a tricky question because it's usually too low, you know. And so what are you going to do? If you have these fabricated by someone, you'll be paying a lot of money. And so in that case, I had the chance to really, other than the laser cutting and the galvanizing and the coating of these pieces, we were able to do everything in the studio. So we could weld them, you know, and produce this piece to a large extent in the studio, which of course saves a lot of money. So I am, and plus I have a certain interest in this sort of fabrication aspect of things, versus other artists sometimes take a more hands-off approach and have everything fabricated and almost don't touch the work anymore. Where I never sort of took that position, and so in that way, it can become actually really crucial because otherwise, you know, you can't do a piece like that if the budget is too low, and and you're looking at fabrication costs that are just crazy. So there's certain practical aspects, you know, in terms of being able to produce certain things yourself, if you have an interest in doing so. Right, I mean, these are, of course, technical questions and not so much regarding the concept, but they become really relevant when you want to do a piece like that. And so, yeah, so this also has a lot to do, I think, with the work that I do in the studio. So I think, but this is something you kind of realize once you get into these things and work professionally. But I also think that, you know, so for example, it worked to my advantage, the fact that I actually did all this stuff back in school, learn how to weld, learn how to work with materials, because then it gave me the opportunity to be able to have a lot of control over my production process, versus otherwise you always depend on other people to produce for you, which makes it more expensive, as I said, and sometimes also takes away some of the excitement in things, I think. Yeah, so you'd have to tell me if there was something confusing about this, but this is a little bit of background as to that piece.
I can make you a question.
Yeah, please, yes.
I'm curious about, like, because working, ragazzi non fate casino e vi stecco tutti.
She's a strict teacher, huh? All right.
When you have the power, you have to do it sometimes.
Yeah,
Much
I know.
When you first approached this project, which was a commission, you was perhaps first of all invited to see the space. So from the very first, because that's what I'm asking them to do also, to produce 3 projects starting from the space and not starting just from an abstract idea. So when you first saw the space, what was your like first idea association, and how long did it take to visualize it into a first row of the installation? Did you have more option in the beginning that you then drop it?
Yeah,
or
true.
you just,
Yeah.
like included something in the initial idea? How was
Right.
your mental process from the first glance on the space to this final point? That
Yeah, definitely a very significant question. The whole process, I didn't speak much about that. But yeah, of course, first of all, right, it's empty and you walk in with, you know, and it's a kind of a slow process. But I think there, you know, and as I said, you kind of let the space speak to you and to your ideas, and you know, over time, I think it becomes more and more precise. But it really, I have to say, other than the production, which was just work, you know, the process of developing this concept was just really a pain. I mean, in that way, it took me months to come up with a really sort of coherent concept that I could then say, okay, we're going to now move into production, because of course you can't start production if you're not really firm on how, you know, the concept is going to look like. And of course then you also have the pressure from these people who have commissioned you. They want the piece as soon as possible, and so you kind of have to try to keep everyone happy. But no, in the beginning, I did actually think about text pretty early on. As I said, text is just really a fraction of my work, so this is not in any way indicative of my practice as a whole. But I mean, obviously, you can see this like strong idea of or strong emphasis of the horizontal and the sort of linearity of the space, which makes text a very kind of obvious, you know, idea, I think, to be working with, because it just lends itself so well to the spatial situations. I had this idea, and then this other thing I thought of was this idea of acceleration. You know, this it's almost like a tube, right, or something, and so I thought of things like a particle accelerator, where things are accelerated to the point where they disintegrate and they collide, and so in this moment of collision, things are opened up, and so this here is exactly that. This idea of accelerating text and signifiers and information to the point where it loses its coherence, and becomes, and something opens up, and this, to try to work with that idea here, where it becomes almost like a modernist sort of abstract image, which then, of course, but has this background, so it's not just a formalism, of course. So I did have these sort of abstract ideas to begin with, as Luana just asked, and then, of course, you work with them and try to make them more and more precise. I also had a curator that was involved, which was actually very good, so we could have a back and forth from time to time, and I could present my ideas and get some feedback, and therefore be able to kind of sharpen, I think, the concept to the point where finally we were actually able to say, okay, we can now move into production. And I really have to say the most kind of, the longest and most difficult for me was to really come up with a concept for the space. Because the worst thing that could happen is, right, you start too early, you produce too early, and then you figure out that, oh, okay, it was just not exactly what what I was going to do. I mean, there's so many factors, right? Even the size of the typography. I mean, everything basically. Every decision matters in art. Everything that you do matters. So I think you also kind of have to take your time. I mean, and not let yourself be. If you ever get into a situation like that, not let yourself be pressured, because in the end you're going to be responsible for the piece and only you. And I think it's important, to make people wait for as long as they have to. But the pressure can be pretty tough. Also, of course, when you have a deadline, then you have to deliver. I didn't really have it, so I was able to extend and extend and extend. And so again, these abstract ideas, they became more and more precise. And we discussed color, we discussed typography and font and all these things. And finally, we're able to build actually a model. So of course, which you have to at this scale. And then finally moved into production, and then things were pretty clear.
So you did produce a three-dimensional model?
Yeah, actually a physical model to, yeah. That's right, yeah. And
do you have any picture of the maquette?
no, I'm not. No, I don't really. I mean, actually, it's we still have it, but they're still storing it. But that would be good. I mean, actually, I have to say we did not in the end make like a one-to-one image sort of model of the piece, because once it was clear, I guess roughly what we were going to do, right? It was more used as a sort of a as a discursive thing where, right, we would kind of sit down and discuss things, but we did not. It was not necessary to make a real one-to-one model in the sense that it would reflect the exact position of every piece. I mean, as an architect would do, of course, right? So I didn't have to do that. But it's a part, of course, at this scale, and you kind of, I think, have to work with. It's almost expected you work with with a model. So yeah, but I think again the process of, and of course I had a couple ideas that I then let go of that turned out to be just not, I guess maybe possible, but of course you can only do so much, right? So you have to make a decision. And yes, I also went through the process of having certain ideas, but then taken other directions over time. But I do think it's a very, even for me, I mean, at this scale, I had not worked at this scale, so it's great. I think how when you do that, it opens up possibilities and doors for the work and for future possibilities that and options and shows and commissions that are really exciting. So you kind of realize how you really need to work and to do something to move the work to to sort of new and maybe unknown, sort of realms. Anyway, so that's a little bit about that. Are there any other questions? Yes, please.
Why did you choose the philosopher Nietzsche, and how is it connected with the destruction of words and with the space in general?
Well, yeah, again, so with Nietzsche, I could get into this. I thought I may not really because it may become too complex. Actually, it's not so complex after all. So Nietzsche has in the Zarathustra, which you may know, has this, one of his significant works, has this dialogue between the dwarf and Zarathustra, and there is a really beautiful sort of part in it where they're discussing this idea of the eternal return that I briefly mentioned, and they're also discussing this in the sense of like this, they're talking about this long hallway, and doesn't history kind of go down this hallway and doesn't repeat itself. So it really, when I came across that, I knew I was going to work with this idea of the return, but I didn't quite know how and what I would find. But this really seemed to work just perfectly with this space. Like to me, it almost seemed like this was designed for this space. So that's why I choose Nietzsche for one thing. Now, of course, the other part is another philosopher who comes more out of an analytic tradition, and it's not even so important as to who that is, but it's more the idea that I was going to combine, as I said, this idea of the return and repetition and circularity with this other part which talks about like possible, worlds and identities and the counterfactual course of history. So again, this is what it's about, and this is how I chose these sources. Now you were asking, how does this relate to the text disintegrating? Is that what you? I wouldn't say necessarily that I'm deriving this out of the subject matter. It's more this idea of this idea of actually when you see the typography, every single element. It's not just a font, but it's basically everything is edited to the point where the text is stretched, or it's like warped, or it's like I really wanted to to work with this idea of meaning becoming unstable, and meaning, and actually talking about how fragile meaning actually is, and signifiers are. So it's text, but it's also, and the piece of course makes a certain statement, as you said, right? But then it also, in a way, calls into question the stability of that meaning, and how how sort of fragile meaning actually is. So I would say in that way, it's more that idea that I was going to work with in terms of this destruction of the text, and of course not so much destruction actually, but maybe more this idea of this negation, this opening up of something through this negation, so yeah, I would say that in terms of the sources. But yeah, that was also a kind of a long process of figuring out what kind of text to use for the piece. Yeah, I can talk some about some other work if you have any. Yes, please. Yeah.
Is this the biggest work, the biggest piece that you worked on?
Basically, yes.
And for curiosity, what about the smallest one? How do you approach?
I mean, yeah.
Teeny tiny.
Is that what you mean, or no?
No. How did you approach with a smaller space? What's your content and personal preference and workflow?
You mean how would I approach a smaller space? Is that what you mean? Well, I guess I would approach okay, when I was doing this, I was saying this could be like an addition, like a smaller piece, right? But that would not be made according to that logic. When you're saying a smaller space, you mean a piece made specifically for a smaller space, right? Honestly, I would approach a smaller space the same way that I would approach that, except that, you know, you're maybe somewhat more limited on a formal terms of scale, right? But I don't think there's even that much of a difference technically. I'm not sure if I answered your question that way. Yeah, but what was there? There was something else you asked.
No, how do you approach something smaller, like this 100 meter?
Yeah.
All way, what about 1 meter square room?
Quindi che altro tipo di lavori fa?
Sì.
Vuoi sapere?
No, vabbè,
Qual era
no,
il
c'era
più
più
piccolo che
lavoro che
aveva
abbiamo fatto più piccolo,
Qual era il più piccolo
dello
che
spazio, no,
I
comunque
think
mi ha
if you
risposto.
have a documentation of like type of like other works, the studio-based work you do, the one that is not site-specific, maybe
Yeah,
also,
yeah.
answer the question.
Right. But true. I mean, so again, if it's a smaller space, I would say it's the exact same thing. You enter the space, you let the space speak to you, you connect the space to your ideas, and you develop something. Whether it's a small or a big space doesn't really matter, except that the bigger space is going to take more work. But I think it's no difference in terms of how to approach a space for me. Now, of course, when you ask about studio-based work, that's very different. You know, I mean, I go from very small to very big, but that's of course a different type of working for me. A type of the thinking is even different. So, but I think you meant spaces, right? And I think there's no real difference. I wouldn't say there's a difference actually. I mean, obviously, you know, yes. I mean, there is of course excitement connected to a big space because it's just a challenge. It's a real challenge. You know, how to fill a space, how to, you know, do a really coherent work. And I tried to develop a real like sort of system that would work according to the logic of the space and would inscribe itself into the space you know, but really take on the sort of the logic of the space as I understood it. And so you're going to have an easier time, I assume, with a smaller space, you know, because it's just more, I guess, easier to work with. But yes, I mean, I think it's super exciting to do something as big as that because you can really kind of test yourself in a way and your work, how you're going to be able to respond to that situation. Yeah.
Can you explain me a little about the colors? Why yellow, why silver, and black?
Yeah. Well, I guess basically I had my first sort of idea was to not even use color at all because I did not really see a necessity to work with color in terms of what I had in mind. So I was looking at, you know, ways to kind of avoid color in the beginning. So I was looking at kind of like white, black, and sort of the silver was a way to I was actually trying to evade the question of color in the piece in the beginning. So that's how I came up with, obviously the most obvious maybe thing, you work with text, you choose black, right? Because text tends to always be black in a way. But that maybe was for me like a bit of a too obvious thing to do. So I was going to move on and maybe I was going to use white, but then I thought white would be kind of boring because I already have a lot of white. So I thought it could be interesting to work with silver, you know, so that would be something that evades the question of color, but still isn't white, it still isn't black, and isn't gray either, really. That's how I actually came up with the silver. But then, hold on, this is giving me a hard time. Anyway, you know the piece. Yeah, so then I guess with the yellow, there was this idea that I mean, I guess this is kind of almost like a formal game in a way, a little bit, and I can't really explain how that would be necessarily rooted in subject matter, because also when you can give very precise reasons for color choices, it can also become a little bit sort of obvious and sometimes not very interesting. But yeah, we were trying to include like one color into the piece, other than, of course, this situation here, which I can talk about a little bit more. But so yeah, we thought, okay, let's get the yellow, and then but other than that, not use any color except for this situation here, where when you think about this idea of a particle collision, anything can happen. You're kind of free. In this moment, I was kind of free to do everything I liked in a way, right? I still have a certain orientation that I wanted to keep, but the idea was like, okay, we have a pretty sort of rigid structure that the piece is oriented towards, but there will be one occasion where we can sort of let go of that and bring in different colors. This idea that when something becomes chaotic, as in like a collision or explosion, you can do whatever you want. So you create a certain kind of little space of freedom for yourself, other than apart from the more sort of rigid structure that the work kind of takes on, other than this. So this is what I have to say about color, basically. Yeah. But it's a great question. Yeah, significant, absolutely. But I think, sometimes I have like very precise and reasons for color choices, and I think they're here too. But it can also become, I think, you can sometimes allow yourself like a little bit of intuitive, decision making in the process. I mean, this is a matter of sort of personal preference, I guess, because there has to be reasons for every choices, but I'm not sure they always have to be connected to a certain subject matter.
Even because otherwise the project will become too literal.
I was going to say, it become very literal, right? So you can say, I could now say, okay, this is about, this first text brings up light or something, and so we choose yellow, but that's not how it works, right? And even if it worked like that, it would be questionable for me, because it's not really logic, I think, as to according to which art necessarily should work. So I guess, I guess sometimes there can be, you can have little moments of sort of freedom within a certain, somehow more rigid structure, I would say. Yeah. Well, I can talk about another. If you have no more questions, then I'll maybe go on with one more piece, and then I guess that's maybe it. So I guess this could be interesting in a way in terms of the spatial situation also. So these are, this is an installation at ABC Fair in Berlin from 2015, so from last year. And so you see it's a very sort of industrial setting, and basically the situation was that the gallery had what's called a freestanding position. So you have basically just space, right? No walls, no nothing, and you have to somehow work with that. And now these, pieces are basically, they're not paintings really, but they kind of take on a sort of painting-like. They're actually prints, but they take on a painting-like shape. So they're designed, of course, to go on walls. And let me just show you the back of them, so you, I guess, would understand the structure a little bit better. Yeah. So this is what they look like from behind, right? They're made of aluminum, and they're actually pretty big. So you're looking at 3 meters in height and 2 meters in width. And so they're actually, of course, designed to go on walls, but we didn't have walls. So then I think it's kind of interesting when you have a situation like that, because, of course, you have to kind of think about how to make, in a way, an installation out of out of a work that is in fact not designed to be freestanding in the way that this is. But this can actually be quite interesting, So we put up the structure, this wood structure, and in fact actually ended up working great. But yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, something to consider, right? So I think you sometimes have to have this flexibility of being willing to work in a completely sort of unusual spatial situation, given, of course, the background of the work. Let me come back to how these are made. Okay, let's go. If I can. Oh yeah. No, I can. So these were made just before I, in fact, started working on this other piece. So you'll see there's a sort of a real difference in terms of the shape that the work takes, oftentimes. And so these are big silk screens. Again, and also here, these structures, the aluminum structures, the frames and everything, the panels we produce them in the studio, so I'm able to produce them myself with assistance, which is also great because, again, if you have this fabricated, you're looking at much higher costs. So the ability to do certain things yourself is sometimes really crucial in the process of fabrication, because it can make a huge difference. And also, of course, gives you this sort of edge when you are able to work maybe more precise than most fabricators would actually be able to. And it gives you a very nice, I think, control over the process. And it's something that I tend to, as I said before, value a lot. This idea of being in control to a certain extent of your own production process. Anyway, they're spray painted, so it takes a long time to get them to the point where actually I'm in fact able to do the work being the print, right? So we do everything in the studio, even the big screens. We built the screens, do the exposure and everything, because of course there's no place that will do 2 meter by 3 meter silk screening, so you kind of have to invent this sort of thing yourself, which is also, of course, interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, I can talk about the subject matter of these pieces, but just from a formal perspective, I think it's interesting to think about how these wall-based works, can become a quite interesting installation in their own right. And of course, they're all three, they're autonomous works, right? They're going to go on and be installed in different homes or whatnot. But I actually really like this idea of how they came together in the space. Also making visible the backside, which of course usually is you cannot see, and you're not really supposed to. But you kind of realize that there's a strange quality to it, in fact. And it also makes you think differently about your work, and maybe actually opens up doors where you realize that maybe the backside isn't so unimportant. And anyway, so I'm saying this can be great because it makes you see the work in a different light sometimes, and if you are attentive to all these hidden, I think, possibilities in the work, it really can open up something. So I think this flexibility, is great because, again, it can open something up. But now, of course, basically for me, most important is what's on the technique for one thing, and the conceptual background. And I can talk, of course, about that. But I was going to emphasize to you, I guess, this idea of, of being sort of flexible and actually maybe, there is of course a conceived space for a work, and that's right, and you have that in mind, and you want the work to have that sort of location, but sometimes something opens up when that is kind of being called into question, so I think it's good to keep an open mind about such things. And so the prints, I mean, they're actually kind of sort of modified silk screens. I suppose you're familiar with the technique of silk screening, right? You expose a screen, and then you can print, and it basically comes out of the media and of course newspapers. So this idea of reproduction is very important, and artists of course have used it to either critique or sort of play with this idea of how the media represents reality. I'm not really doing this here. In fact, they're all unique pieces, and it's also a sorry. What's going on? Is it that? Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, of course, silkscreen is always based, usually based on photography, and this is also the case here. It's like two, you can see this like these two, the one on the left and the one on here, the silver one, being images of a taken in the forest. I in fact took them even before I went to art school myself, so that was years ago. And the other two are galaxies, which I photographed out of an astronomy book, and so they're kind of blurry, and it's almost like they're I guess it's almost like hard to see what actually. I mean, they're pretty close to something abstract, I guess, but they're not really. So in both cases, I was going to work with this idea of light, for example, light as in a more determinate way. I mean, this idea of again, this other piece which I told you has this idea of history, how history unfolds and develops, and this is pretty much present here too. I was going to work with this idea of a certain end of this idea of light in the forest, where you have this like double negation, and this idea that things may come to an end historically, which of course there are precedents for that, right, in terms of philosophy and concepts of history. And then this other way of conceiving of things, which of course would be more open, and would be this idea that actually the way that things unfold is based on complete contingency. So I'm oftentimes working with this idea of negotiating certain concepts and philosophies and ideas of how things unfold and develop. And I bring them up in my work without necessarily me taking this position myself. So it's more a critique and a negotiation versus me necessarily taking a distinct position myself, which for other reasons I oftentimes, I'm not sure if I actually even could. But so again, it's like this idea of light as in something determinate and something, almost teleological, with this idea of it leading to an end, of things leading to an end, versus a more open and, as I said, like, I guess contingent idea of how things unfold. And they're actually modified, so the printing technique is modified. If I could talk about that a little bit. You don't see it here, I guess, but the printing is done with a specific sort of glue. So the print itself in the beginning is just transparent, almost non-visible. And then these black ones, they're painted with charcoal powder, so then that powder will stick to the glue, and then the image comes out. And the silver ones are, in fact, silver leaf is applied, and then it will stick to the image, and then it's kind of brushed off, so it will remain as to the exact spots where the glue was before, if that makes sense. I'm just saying this because I needed to, again, I needed to find a way to avoid this idea of doing tens or hundreds of these, which of course is sort of implicit in this idea of silk screening. And to avoid that, I had to kind of find a way to make these, to turn this technique into something unique, something that I'm not able to predict myself so much. So that's also what I find exciting, because I never can quite predict as to how this is going to turn out. And they have a pretty strong, I think, painterly feel to them, which I like. I'm pretty much coming out of painting myself to a certain extent, and so it gives me the chance to do something close to painting without at all doing painting, right? And without, of course, also, without involving my own kind of subjectivity, as in using the brush and doing certain things. I can completely rely on this like mechanical technique of image producing, and yet I have these moments of surprise and moments of uncertainty that arise out of this modification of the technique. So my point is that to you maybe is that it's even the most sort of traditional or seemingly out of date or whatever techniques can in fact become really interesting if you find ways to modify them to suit your own interests, So, and even the idea of doing these really big, it's a simple idea, but when you try to do it, it's not so simple. In fact, it's quite complex. Even that can open up something. So I think, even techniques that may seem to you not so interesting or out of date or boring can become quite interesting when you modify them to a certain extent and try to make them suit your interests. I mean, even if you say, I'm not interested in etching or something, right? Well, what's to say that you aren't? I mean, you can find a way to be interested in it. All you have to do is think about ways to force it to your needs. I mean, I think this is a very interesting concept. Yeah.
How do you work at the beginning of a project? For example, how many times did you visit a place, or where did you search from some inspiration? I don't know.
I mean, this question, I guess, pertains more to the previous piece, right? How many times do I? For both. Well, and here, for example, you are, here it's a little bit different, I would say, because of course, you're looking at, these pieces were, I guess, made without me being aware of this spatial situation that they're put in. As I said, I mean, they're made for, I do them in the studio, and I know they're going to be going on walls. But then what do you do when you have to show 4 of them in a sort of a open space like this, right? And then you have to be kind of creative and figure something out, and this can become really interesting. But of course, I didn't go to the space and then think about the work, right? I went to the space and thought about how to install the work, which of course becomes, in this moment, a part of the work. I would agree with that. And yet, of course, that's only temporary, because after that, it's taken down, and they're again, going back to being just autonomous pieces. Versus when I go to the space, this hallway space, I really think of how to do a concept for this space, versus here, I thought about how to install the work. So these are 2 distinctly different things, if that answers your question. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So again, I mean, this is, I guess, you could actually think that these are 2 different artists, I assume. I mean, I don't have this sort of way of looking at my work like that, because I'm much too close to it. But I tend to, try to always open up doors in my work, and I I don't really think about style or anything like that. It of course happens. In the end, you have a certain style because you are you and you have a certain subjectivity and interest, and that's going to manifest itself in the work. But it doesn't interest me to any extent, really. So yeah, I mean, these two are pretty recent works, and pretty much what I'm working on right now in both cases. Yeah, but I guess what's most important, I wasn't going to give an artist talk, really. I was more interested in maybe opening up something for you, because again, I mean, I think it's really everything can be interesting. I mean, I remember as a student being not interested in certain things, but it's not really the case. Everything you can work with, pretty much everything, if you find ways to to make it suit your work. And I think it's a very interesting idea because it made me have have a way more open mind, and also I guess it makes the work more complex if you're able to have this this kind of dialogue with potentially everything. But I understand it may also be of interest to be sort of have a more technique-based, medium-based focus, which I think is nothing wrong with. It's just nothing that I do really myself. I have a more conceptual background, so for me it's ideas first, and whichever physical manifestation they take is then up to me to decide. But it does start with the ideas, and I can see that other artists, for them it's going to start with the medium, and if you take that position, then it's of course different, obviously, and that's fine, totally. Yeah, so that's that. Any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to give it back to Luana.
Okay, and we take a. If you don't, se non avete più, sorry, I'm
Yeah,
speaking Italian, but officially we speak Italian here.
Oh yeah, I know.
Se non avete altre domande, io, siccome lui è venuto qui proprio in amicizia, gli vado ad offrire un caffè sotto, fatevi 15 minuti di pausa e ci rivediamo qui tra 15 minuti. Ok? Grazie.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.